This is Don Stevens on an early March 1979 day on the Côte d'Azur. Beautiful sunshine for a change, powdered snow up on the mountains. One can easily see on this sort of a day why Baba spent so many weeks with various of the Mandali in Cannes, near where I live. I recently heard from Dick Duman that there was an urgent request in to make a 2-tape summary of the theme of creation. That's a pretty tall order, of course. There was one group of young people in London who worked on the theme of creation, primarily, as Baba gives it in God Speaks, for about 3 or 4 years, and I think in that time making on each session an average progress of perhaps 2 or 3 sentences. We may have gotten to page 80, something like that. So at any rate, let's try to do the impossible and encapsulate some of the high points at any rate into a couple of tapes. What I should emphasize is that while the major material obviously comes from God Speaks, there's a great deal of other which through the years has been absorbed into it, many details, many implications from various other things that Baba has given out. There have also been many conversations through the years with Arish where I've tried to clarify my own mind on some of the obscure points that I seem still incapable of absorbing. Francis Brabazon, while he was still in India with Baba, did his best to clarify a number of points for me. And I should also say on this credit part that inevitably, having been trained in the sciences and in mathematics in the university, inevitably I have interpreted many things that Baba has given out in terms of my own scientific background, not vice versa. Baba clarifying what I had learned in the sciences and making more clear, more coherent, rational, acceptable, digestible what I had learned in the university. So let's jump immediately now then into the theme of creation. I'd like to start that out by a brief recollection of what Baba tells us reality is. What is the truth? After all, that's the central thing that we're all striving for. Usually, we want truth in order to interpret and give some sort of a sound base to our daily living, to have some sense that it's rooted in a type of meaning or a base which is not going to disappear or change so radically tomorrow that we say, oh dear God, that's all gone down the drain. We've got to go back to the drawing board and start all over again. If one cannot have for one's daily actions and judgments some sort of a sense of stability, dependability, being based on something long-term or eternal, hopefully, then it becomes very difficult to live one's daily life. So what does Baba say that reality, the truth is? Well, like all mystics, avatars through the ages, he says that reality, truth, is God, and that nothing exists but God. Well, you've all heard that so many times that I'm sure you nod your heads with a certain impatience and say, well, let's get on with it. But really, one has to reflect a little bit more on not just that statement, but some of the qualities that Baba describes as being key in God, key of God, because they have to be terribly important for us. Well, first of all, he points out that obviously God is infinite. And the characteristic of infinitude, which we get directly from mathematics, is that there is nothing conceivable in a minus or a plus direction outside of that infinitude. It follows automatically. Infinitude is infinite, and it's all-encompassing. Nothing escapes it. Also, but this is more judging from our limited concept, it is eternal. So God always was. He had no beginning and he has no end. In fact, the concepts of time finally come down to be part of our own dream. And infinitude also, Baba makes very clear, is absolutely indivisible. That means that if we see something that appears to be separate, somewhere or another, that has to be part of a dream or an imagination. And inevitably, part of our job of finding and holding on to reality, the truth, at some point, has to be the unlearning of our own concepts of divisibility, of separateness, and of contrast. So, if these are important characteristics of truth, that the truth, the reality is God, that He is infinite, eternal, and indivisible, and incidentally, there have to be, of course, many other characteristics. Baba talks about in various places all knowledge, power, bliss, love. It's sort of as if, let's say, you and I picked up an apple and we said, all right, let's examine the characteristics of the apple. Obviously, we see, first of all, its shape and its color, and we get a bit more imaginative and we sniff it, and if we get a bit greedy, we bite into it, and we find that an apple has many different avenues of registering on our senses and therefore upon our brain. So reality can have many characteristics, but it is all wrapped into one. And it's only because we have different channels to our consciousness that we sort out these various different characteristics. Because infinitude and indivisibility has to be infinite and indivisible. The way that we look at it is part of the mechanism by which we exist. And so, if we interpret any part of ourselves, of what we live in, as being separate, as contrasting, or God only knows, in opposition, then that has to be inevitably a part of infinitude in imagination, and Baba explains clearly that all of this is in the zero part of infinitude, but still within infinitude. Of course, the second part of it that is of great interest to us is, what are human beings? What's creation? What are they all about? Now, if the first definition that we just gave of reality, if it is true, and here perhaps we just have to accept on faith that the greatest beings, according to the judgment of society down through the ages, the greatest beings who have ever lived have all been unanimous in their definition that reality, truth is infinite God and nothing else. If this is true, then inevitably it has to follow that being part of infinitude, being within infinitude, non-separated from infinitude, we have to be God. And inevitably, we have to possess all of His properties, and therefore creation must also be within it. All right, enough of rather dry definitions and shorts of bits of reasoning. But I feel it's terribly necessary that one concentrate for a few minutes right at the start to clear the decks and be just terribly clear with oneself that if these rather all-encompassing, very difficult to grasp definitions are true, then the properties and the things that flow out of it have to be of basic fundamental importance to us and how we go about our own lives. So now let's jump way back into the beginning as Baba describes the original state of God, which he calls the beyond state of God. One of the things that always shocks people when they start to take a look at Baba's description of God is that the original state of God is 100% unconscious. This flies so completely in the face of our Christian tradition, or at least what we interpret of it, that it's very difficult for us to accept. We picture God as all-knowing. And the idea that there could have been a state of God somewhere within reality in which He was not all-knowing consciously, it's very difficult for us to accept. And yet, for better or for worse, this is what Baba tells us we must accept as being the original state of God. Yes, infinite and eternal and indivisible, but 100% unconscious. And then Baba gets a little bit tricky here, but he has to lay it on the line because this is the part that's the base of all creation. He talks about something which he calls a whim. The whim involved in the 100% unconscious state of God, the whim to possibly He can't even say desire, because God has no desires, but the whim to know his divinity consciously. And then Baba follows with a second point. It's one of the few times when Baba quite clearly separates out reason, intellect, and says there is no way that one can describe in words or give the reasoning for the beginning of the surging of that whim. He just says, one day when you're God yourself, the whole picture of that initial surging, the mechanics in back of it will be clear to you, but accept it on my authority as Baba God, who knows within himself, Baba knows within himself the mechanics of it, that for no reason that I can give you in words, the whim began to move. All right, now here is where I think that we must just stop all the cameras, freeze the picture, the concept of God and creation, into a still. Let's project it as a slide onto the screen and just hold it at the instant when the whim began to manifest. What are its characteristics, inevitably? Now, here I have to insert the way of thinking and feeling of Don Stevens, but again, very closely to some of the imagery that, as you know, Baba gives us, and reflect on the still pond, or the ocean, or the quiet lake, not a movement of wind across it. This is the manner in which I always conceive God, in the beyond stage, in the completely unconscious state of God, not a ripple on the surface. And then, if one conceives that the involved whim of God to know his divinity consciously begins to manifest, I know of no way to conceive of it, to come to any sort of grips and to examine any implications, unless one thinks of something like a little boy over on the side of the shore, let's call him Johnny Whim, who tosses a stone out into the pond, and of course where it goes in, and this is what Baba calls the Om point of creation, where the whim manifests itself, there's a plop, and up comes a counter surge of water, and it in turn falls back into the same area where the stone had gone in, and what happens? There's a wave motion. And so our first, let's say, examination of the stop camera at that point is the first wave. Well, you know and I know that a wave is, I suppose, let's say the mathematical definition of it is a simple sine curve. It has a certain form, very simple, and within that simple form, there are the two prime ingredients of creation as you and I know it. First of all, everything that we know, that we analyze about creation, breaks down into an analysis of waveforms. I know that there are some complexities in this analysis, but let's not get too terribly modern and involved with ourselves. What is sound, for instance? Well, it's a waveform within the atmosphere, or within a solid you can transmit sound through a solid also, as well as through a liquid or through a gas. The simplest way of conceiving it, in the simple medium in which we're used to it, is a compression and a contraction, which is represented graphically as a sine form, or a combination of sine forms of compressions and rarefactions. What is light? Similar. How do we conceive the transmission of radio waves, television, X-rays? All of this, they boil down into waveforms. What is matter itself? Well, when we can get it into the state in which we can begin to understand it, we know that matter is convertible into energy. Energy, again, falls into, as we have to represent it, into waveforms. So, what we call creation resolves into a tremendous number of different types of waveforms, of ups and downs, of compressions and rarefactions, of higher intensity energy levels and lower intensity energy levels, which are in contrast, and these pulsing forms constitute the reality as we know it of creation. A symphony, for instance, is simply an extremely complex combination of much simpler sine waveforms. So, as we stopped the camera just after little Johnny Whim over on the lakefront plopped in his stone, we see the first simple, fundamental, characteristic manifestation of creation as you and I know it. And all of creation as we know it is simply a complexification of that simple, original plunk. Well, what's another characteristic? And here, I think we get to a very important key, because if creation seems to surge out of God's whim to know his divinity consciously, all right, somewhere or another, unconscious God must be converted into conscious God. And so consciousness has to be the other key element that's involved in all of this great hullabaloo of creation, universes, galaxies, human beings, molecules, atoms, and so on. How is consciousness generated out of all of this? Well, there's a great deal discussed, particularly in the literature of modern psychology. Wasn't it Carl Jung who, in one of his books, very aptly described consciousness as the quality generated between the poles of contrast? I may be somewhat misquoting, but that certainly is very close to what Jung laid out. And the more I reflected on that in my early teens and then became quite excited about it when I began to reflect on what Baba tells us about creation, let's go right back to that first simple sine wave that is created on the calm water face of the quiet, tranquil lake. And what do you have as a part of that simple form? Well, obviously you have the upper part of the wave and you have the trough of the wave, which are right next to each other. And what is that but the most simple, primitive form of contrast? So in the very first disturbance created as the whim begins to manifest is the simple base for the generation of consciousness, upper and lower, contrast, apparent separation. But isn't it our own way of going about things which regards it as contrasting and separate? As you look through a modest little list of things of which you are conscious, you're always immediately struck by the fact that there are contrasts. For instance, the simplest of all, night and day, there's a difference in light. There's black and there's white. There's ability of our eyes to see easily and ability of our eyes to be unable to see, or else we have to go light a match or a candle or turn on a light. So we're aware of the phenomenon of relative lightness simply because of our experience of contrast there. Hot and cold, the same way you touch a hot stove or you touch an element in a refrigerator and you're quite obviously aware of contrast. And so one is aware of temperature. And of course we refer this back to our own body temperature. That is the unconscious norm. So things are colder than our body and they're hotter than our body. And if they get too far in either extreme, we're extremely uncomfortable. And in fact, our skin or whatever part of our body where we come into contact with it registers pain, extreme displeasure. But nevertheless, it is our own sensory mechanism which points out contrast, and we register that quality because of the contrast. Well, let's take a slightly more sophisticated example from chemistry, for instance. I was taught originally, when I began to study the atomic table and the elements, I was taught that elements were divided into two quite separate classes, the metals and the non-metals. The metals being usually shiny, ductile, carry electricity, and the non-metals rather granular, dull. If you try to pull them into a thread, they fall apart. It's almost impossible for them to conduct electricity, or they may even be very good insulators against the travel of electricity. So first of all, when my chemistry teacher starts to teach me chemistry, she in this case points out, contrasting characteristics. So I get a concept fixed into my consciousness. And then a little bit later in the game, she makes more complex. And she begins to point out that a little unfortunately for this neat system of classification, there are ones that fit in between, and they're neither completely metal nor completely non-metal, and they're transition elements, let us say. Carbon is a beautiful example of that. It's granular, it's non-ductile, and yet it does a beautiful job of conducting electricity. Lots of filaments are made of carbon, as a matter of fact. And the same way in biology. Originally we're taught in biology or zoology or whatever we call it nowadays, that the living world is divided into plant and animal. And of course there's a contrasting world of the inanimate, but let's forget it. But the animate world has plants and animals, and plants have chlorophyll and they have roots and leaves and they're fixed, whereas animals move around in their environment. Maybe they go back to the same den or the same little corner to sleep at night, but they can move around freely. And they don't have leaves, and above all, they don't have chlorophyll. They have hemoglobin instead, quite a different system of absorbing and utilizing energy. And all of a sudden, one day, as you're sitting around looking through the microscope, your professor puts underneath the mic on a slide a very strange creature. He moves around. He has flagella which wiggle in the air so he can sense where he is. But lo and behold, instead of having hemoglobin, he's got little chloroplasts. His mechanism functions on chlorophyll. And so here again, the biologist explains that we do have organisms which fit in between. And gradually, one begins to wake up to the fact that while consciousness is originally generated by contrast, as consciousness becomes more sophisticated and begins to reflect upon the system, and then reflect even further on the nature of reality, one begins to see that the original idea of creation, of nature, of reality being broken up into contradictory, contrasting, opposing elements, one gradually finds that it's a spectrum and that there are very real bridging points. And it's our way of looking at things and the way we originally come to consciousness which originally contrasts this. This caused one of the great thinkers of our days, Korsybsky, who wrote this rather astonishing book, Science and Sanity, and which became the basis of the semanticis. Korsybsky pointed out that somebody whom we call Aristotle, and who laid out the beginning outlines of science, had done a great disservice to reality in the manner in which we think by breaking nature, creation, down into contrasting elements. Korsybsky says this doesn't happen to be true, and because it doesn't happen to be true, but we've been so hipped on it for a long time, this has given rise to a great many of our misconcepts and even of a great deal of emotional and psychic disorder in us. So, at any rate, we don't want to belabor that particular point because it's a little aside from our job of the moment, which is to go back and take a look at what Baba says about creation. So, let's go back to that stop slide, which I hope is still registering on some photographic screen in your mind. And you have that first original little wave formed on the surface of the quiet lake, the original 100% unconscious state of God in the beyond stage, when Johnny Whim plumps the first disturbance onto the surface and raises the first part of the disturbance, which inevitably we must conceive, and which I am sure actually works that way, is a waveform. The wave is the fundamental, the primordial energy condition of creation. All of creation, as far as one can feel into it, is a complexity of different types of waves existing in what you and I would call different media of transmission. And secondly, that wave within itself contains the most fundamental, original condition necessary, as far as we can analyze it, for the generation of consciousness. That is apparent contrast within the form itself. So we have the two conditions of creation which apparently are necessary for the generation of God's consciousness. Waves underlying matter and contrast underlying the generation of consciousness. Now, if we can think of going back to our camera, which is doing a photographic process of registering, especially those early moments of creation, moments as you and I would call them. So let's let the motion picture camera take just one more frame, and let's throw that up on the screen and take a little bit of time to see what is apparently going on in the second frame of creation. All right, we have a simple wave which is generated. And the simple wave is, let us say, the first vibration of energy. And the very simple first part of creation is created. Suppose, let us say, that we take a look at that wave. It immediately starts traveling, of course, on the lakefront. It moves. And so the impulse of creation is spread out with enormous speed. And it's spread widely. That little ripple, which in the first instant was just, let's say, a counter plop of water falling back on the wave front, becomes a wave which has an increasing radius, and it extends on out, and the radius, you might say the total wave front, becomes larger and larger and larger in circumference. But let's stop it at the second frame. If we have contrast, immediately the first iota of consciousness is generated within that contrast. It's imprinted, as it were, within the structure of creation itself, because simple contrast generates simple consciousness. Let's not worry quite yet about drop souls and things of that sort, but inherent within that first instant of creation, the first generation of the first simple wave front, there is the element of energy, which is creation itself, and there is the element of contrast, and contrast automatically impresses upon creation itself, whatever is impressible in the environment, the first simple iota of consciousness. But of course, the creation itself at that point is extraordinarily simple and primitive, as is the consciousness that's generated at that point. The most simple fundamental impression of consciousness, and incidentally the most simple fundamental impression itself, because right at that moment, habit pattern itself is built up in the impression that is generated. Everything happens at once, you see. Creation as we know it in its simplest form happens there. But what about it? What about the type and the quality and the quantity, also, if one might put it that way, of consciousness that's generated? Well, obviously, the consciousness of the most simple, fundamental wave front is not complex enough, not sophisticated enough to be able to reflect back upon itself and to constitute the mechanism by which God can know his divinity consciously. So obviously the whim hasn't done its job. But let's say the whim, obviously, and God are not that naive. After all, if God is infinite and perfect, he must have a whim which is capable of doing the job. And so the whim, instead of, let's say, the whole thing dying down at that point, and here we have to forget about Johnny Whim on the lakefront and think of the whim more in the form of a spouting crater of lava coming up from a mountain cone. It goes on spouting and spouting and spouting. Or let's say it's as if you were spouting up a series of rocks from down underneath, from the base of the lake, and which keep coming back down. And as another one comes and another spout comes and more disturbance comes, then, of course, first of all, the waves interact. The wave forms become more complex. The contrast, the complexity of contrast becomes more complex. The quality and the quantity of consciousness that are possible from these increasingly complex waveforms of course, is also can be more complex and more sophisticated. So as the whim continues on, it keeps spouting, it keeps surging forth from the ohm point, and the disturbance becomes increasingly complex. Then we begin to get to the state of energy that looks more familiar to us. If we put it on an oscilloscope, it looks more like, let's say, a symphony than just one little tone coming out of a string that is struck exactly in the middle, the most simple form of a sine curve. As the whim continues on, the complexity of the waveforms becomes increased. The quality of the contrast within those waveforms becomes more complex also, and therefore consciousness flowing out of it from more complex experiences, interactions, inevitably becomes more complex, more sophisticated, and more widespread. Finally, of course, and here I think we do not know enough in modern science or in modern astronomy to be able to judge, to be able to visualize the next steps. But it doesn't take too much imagination for us to conceive that the complexity begins to accumulate in globs, to tend to associate within itself, and we begin to come into the first stages of what I would call condensed energy, which is simple material form. Baba said to us when we began editing God Speaks for volume number 2 that he had made a couple of errors, not errors in statement, but perhaps errors in omission, in the original giving out of God Speaks. He said that he should not have started with, let's say, simple gas forms, but there are sub-gas forms, and even more simple energy forms beyond these. In other words, Baba himself bridged over the part that I'm talking about now in those brief comments to us, and he said that one day he would give out a much more complete and a much more complex description of that early phase of creation, which occurs even before the simplest sub-gas forms. So, all right, we have energy in wave forms, and it begins to condense into simple matter. Yes, we know, and as Einstein had predicted, matter and energy are interrelated. Just exactly what it is that breaks down between the two, how the whole story of the mechanism by which energy is converted into matter and matter back into energy, we don't know a lot of the links in that particular chain. But we know from atomic physics that that conversion is real, that it is very precise and very exact. And so we know that that had to occur at a very early stage, well, maybe early in terms of trillions of years of our way of looking at creation, but it had to occur in an early stage, and we get these very, very fine, minute particles of matter. I would like to speculate myself that the first thing that began to occur were the most light forms of matter which were capable of forming, let's say, what we call the mental body. And then it gets a little bit more complex and a bit more dense. We get the forms that can form the subtle world. All of this in creation. And then finally, of course, the physical forms, which we're most familiar with, that our senses react to. And this is the most dense and the most heavily packed, from an energy standpoint, energy form. And here we begin, by to say, to get to the part of the universe that science is quite familiar with, the gas forms. But again, all based on wave energy to start with. And out of that wave, more and more possibility of apparently having separateness and apparently increased and more dense contrast, out of which more heavily registered and underlying consciousness automatically rolls out of these experiences of the condensed energy forms impacting on one another, and also out of that more and more dense forms of impressions, which Baba then calls the sanskaras. Now, when you stop to reflect upon it, this is quite a different mechanism, isn't it, from how we have conceived the universe. The basic impulse to everything, of course, here is the whim itself. It just goes on mechanically, willy-nilly, spouting, increasing the complexity, and the complexity goes from simple gases into, let us say, liquids, into the stone state. The stone has much more definition, much more contrast than a liquid, after all. From stone into metal, there are more subtle possibilities of experience. We conceive that consciousness grows in complexity, and also that the inevitable impressions that are deposited from these apparent experiences within contrast and within apparent separateness, the impressions themselves are heavier, more deeply underlined. Now, what I call the tragedy of creation has to be looked at this point as well. It would be a wonderful success story if just as soon as the first iota of consciousness is generated, if in some fashion or another, that consciousness knew that it was God, and that it started out immediately fulfilling the intent of the whim, and that is that God know his own divinity consciously. But all we can say is that for better or for worse, consciousness did not have the property to reflect upon reality. All that poor little old first drop of consciousness ended up doing was to focus and to identify with the material, the energy environment around it. You can get a good idea of how that happens when you have an accident with your car, for instance. If you run into another car, the other car runs into you, you're immediately aware of a shock. You're angry, you're upset, you're aware of what's outside of your car which has caused it, and all of your focus of attention is riveted on that damn thing on the other side which put dents in your fenders. So this is, for better or for the worse, the way that consciousness, at the instant that it's generated, functions. It functions on the environment. It pins on it. And it says, here is reality. It doesn't even say it's reality. It just automatically goes to the scene of the crime, as it were. So Baba tells us that consciousness, instead of focusing upon the reality of God, focuses upon the imagination of duality and of contrast. And this is true of consciousness as it's generated. Let us go back now. Baba points out to us that as the whim surges, from wherever it surges, and which the mystics define as the own point, there is created a froth of individual drop souls. Even God himself exists within the imagination of being separated, compartmentalized. And so as successive waves of a disturbance fall back, the froth of the individual drop souls, which look upon themselves as being separate and contrasting, become the registering point for the process of interaction within creation. A drop item of consciousness, a drop iota of consciousness is registered on an individual encapsulated drop soul of God himself, and the other part is registered, and that is the impression, the sanskara of the experience. The consciousness registers, focuses on the immediate environment within which it was generated. And this process, unfortunately, goes straight on up into the human stage, but we've skipped too many chapters. What does Baba say next? That after the whim has formed increasing complexity of materiality, first of all into the sub-gaseous forms, then into the gaseous forms, liquid, and we come to stone as being the first material, the first solid state of creation. Here is a stone which is interacting on another stone. They're grinding each other. That is where the most solid part, let's say, of experience is. It doesn't mean that the gas of the atmosphere in the particular world that we now have our camera focused on, it doesn't mean that the atmosphere and the rain, the liquids don't have any effect, but this most solid grinding impression comes from stone grinding on stone. And there is simple stone consciousness, which is generated, and stone impressions, the beginning of sanskaras, actually already in a fairly advanced state, if we want to be honest with each other. But still, the consciousness that is generated is terribly primitive. As a consequence, the whim doesn't stop when materiality has reached the degree of complexity of the stone stage. The whim goes on grinding out that point of disturbance at the own point, grinds out more waves, more disturbance, they keep on becoming, they add to each other, the sine curves keep adding on to each other, the symphony becomes more complex, and finally, the whim itself, the desire of God, the need of God, the whim of God to know his own divinity consciously, precipitates automatically the next stage of creation, within which a more complex experience, interaction, more complex contrast is generated, more complex so-called experiences between apparent separateness, and we get to the mental stage. Baba skips rather quickly through various ones of these, and after the metal, we get into the simplest, what we would call living form. That's the vegetable. Here one certainly has the first evidence of individuality. Much more, let's say, than in the form of stone, because after all, you can have an upthrust of lava and stone. How under the sun does one say what stone or what part of a ridge of mountains or something is associated with a particular drop soul? That phase of it I have to look upon as being completely amorphous. I just don't know, frankly. A number of individuals throughout the decades have asked me whether a great big chunk of granite, let's say, is one or a whole lot of drop souls, and what happens if the thing rolls down the mountainside and is broken into 2 or 10 different fragments. Was there one original drop soul in the great big boulder, and does that become 2 or 10 drop souls, or does the thing essentially die and there are 10 or 2 new drop souls born into the new fragments, and when finally it hits a river and is ground up into small particles of sand? How do we associate all of that with drop souls? I've heard 1 or 2 of the Mandali discuss this in certainly much clearer terms than I can. But I have to leave that stage of creation myself. It's too hazy. But when I come to a tree, yes, there I have the concept of an overall drop soul associated with a tree. But of course that tree also has roots, it has branches, and it has leaves. Where we get with all that complexity in drop souls, I'm not too sure. But the tree grows up, it has experiences, it's beaten around by the winds, it absorbs minerals and moisture, sustenance from the ground, and finally the mechanism as a whole can no longer support an integrated living process. Eventually, metabolism begins to die out, and finally the tree, as we say, the tree dies. But Baba is very clear, and we get into the second major hypothesis that he gives us of creation, and that is that the association of a drop soul is rather complex. A drop soul associates itself with a mental body, a subtle body, and a physical body. And right at that stage, and this begins to occur, of course, in the earliest stages of creation, in the most primitive stages of creation, but here we get into the second enormously important consideration for the human stage, where we are, which we're trying to understand, and trying to figure out how to get on with the job a little bit more vigorously, rapidly, and hopefully with a little less pain involved. And this is involved in the concept that Baba explains to us here of a drop soul being associated with 3 material bodies. Now, the most subtle, light, ephemeral, as it were, almost non-material of those bodies is the mental body. Baba tells us very clearly that it's in the mental body that the impressions, the experiences, the sanskaras, therefore the origins of our habit patterns, of our impulses to repeat habit patterns, are stored. This is, I like to think of it as the black box recording tape, which goes on throughout the entire existence of a particular drop soul. That is never destroyed, it is never dropped. It is so fine, it is so subtle, that when the physical body is changed, it hasn't worn out, it hasn't even come close to it. So the mental body, a particular mental body, again within imagination, is associated with a particular drop soul, and it goes on grinding out this endless tape of electromagnetic impulses, which is memory, the little knots of psychic energy, as Baba describes them, which are the sanskaras. They register, they register, they register, they're kept, they're indelible, they're permanent. They're really as permanent almost as the dropped soul itself. At any rate, throughout the association of that dropped soul with creation, the mental box, the mental body is never destroyed and presumably not damaged. So, next to the mental body is the subtle body. It's a little bit more dense. It is the body that we associate with emotions and the energies of emotions. It also is not destroyed. It's not dropped when our physical body is worn out. It continues on. It has energies associated with it. And then finally we have the physical body with which we are most familiar. It is the one which exists within the cycle of physical creation. It does wear out. When it is dropped, then the dropped soul goes on being associated with the same mental body and the same subtle body. Father tells us that certainly at the human stage we review, we redigest our experiences, but we still have stored all of our experiences in the previous lifetime and in all of the previous lifetimes. But what happens when this combination of soul, mental body, subtle body takes on a new physical body, it takes on a new brain or a new nervous system. And this new nervous system, not having the actual physically stored memories, does not consciously remember within physical creation the things stored in the mental body. The new nervous system acts as a block, usually, to direct conscious physical recall of the experiences which had already been recorded. But nevertheless, those psychic energy knots, the impressions, the samskaras, stored through hundreds of thousands and even millions of years in the mental body, black box, tape recorder, they are there, and Baba explains to us that sooner or later, before the whole process is done, they have to be wiped clean. All right, so let's go back down to the vegetable state, the tree. We have then the first part of creation which seems to have the type of individuality of which we know. Incidentally, there are fascinating experiments that are being run nowadays, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, in which the electric impulses are measured within plants. And there is so much beautiful and rather exciting evidence nowadays that there's quite a nervous and emotional structure within the plant. And one begins to see that at the plant stage, that Baba's definition of the association of the drop soul with the mental body, with the subtle body, with the physical body, is certainly not imagination as far down as that. And if it is true as far down as the plant stage, then we have to agree, I suppose with Teilhard de Chardin, that the basic attributes which we associate with a human being must be present even in the most primitive forms of matter. That as an example, love, which we know at our stage, has to be present in a primitive, rolled up cocoon form, even down in the stones and in the gas stages. Well, Baba tells us that the quality and the quantity of consciousness generated in the plant stage are not sufficient for God to know himself consciously, to know his divinity consciously. The whim hasn't fulfilled the job for which the whim was originally enrolled within God from all time, there being no beginning of God, of course. And so the whim goes on spurting and surging, and the impulses become more complex, and finally creation is precipitated into the next stage of complexity, which can have the possibility of somewhat more complex experiences, therefore of a more complex consciousness being generated, and also, for better or for worse, more complex impressions registered in the mental body. That is the form that Baba calls the worm stage. But this is not enough again, and poor old overworked whim has to go on spouting and spewing forth, and creation continues to be more complex. It then precipitates to the fish form. The same old story again, the fish goes on having experiences and developing consciousness which can be related to the complexity of the fish form, but it reaches its ceiling The fish form can only go to a certain height of consciousness, and the whim, going on spouting, reaches to the next more complex form, physical form, the bird. It finally is exhausted. There is a higher degree of consciousness that has been generated. All of you who have been around birds know the rather extraordinary characteristics and how bright and how affectionate. They have so many characteristics now that we can associate with a human being. But incidentally, don't write off the tree and the philodendron in your living room. From what we can see now, they have their affections and their reactions and their fears too, although undoubtedly in a more primitive form than a bird. But the bird's finally exhausted, goes on to the animal.